I think we'll probably go ahead and get started. We had several other people register for the conversation today, so hopefully they'll jump on. But it's also the Friday before a holiday weekend, so we're happy that you could join us, and we'll be recording this as well, so we'll be able to share that with other folks. All right, next slide. So this is a conversation series that we've been having now for several months that is focused on sort of how COVID has put a flashlight or a spotlight on a lot of the issues that, a lot of the equity issues that have existed for a long time, but COVID has really brought them to the forefront of our attention in a lot of ways, because it's highlighted a lot of our vulnerabilities because of the inequities that still exist in our system. So in that series, today we are going to be talking about increasing equity in your organization. So I know a lot of folks who have attended these in the past have wanted more and more solutions, and I'm really excited about this conversation today. Next slide. All right, so but before we get started, it's really important to understand and realize and take care of ourselves as we have these conversations about inequities in our community, about how we get to equity, because racism is actually traumatic for everyone. It doesn't matter what your race is. Racism affects us all in very real ways. And so I think it's really important that before we start any of these conversations, we always try to center on this idea of self-care. So we know you're not just having these conversations with us, you're having them probably in your daily life. You watch the news, you see these things continue to play out on a daily basis. And it's important to remember that that does have an impact on you, and that it's very important to take care of yourself. So before we get started, today we'd like to practice that. And so if everyone can together, we'll take a few deep breaths together, and then we'll get started. So you can cast your eyes down. No, you don't have your cameras on, so that's fine. But just take a nice deep breath in and let it out. And take another deep breath in. If you're holding tension in your shoulders, try to relax your shoulders and let your breath out. And one more big deep breath. Let it out. Okay. All right, next slide. So today we definitely want you to practice self-care and take good care of yourself. It's Friday. We're probably all a little tired, looking forward to a long weekend, hopefully, and doing something to take care of ourselves. But just remembering that whenever these issues come up, it is important to exercise self-care. We're going to talk a little bit about FutureMakers. We're going to explore structural racism through the lens of COVID-19. You may learn a little bit about our own implicit biases. And then, our really big goal is to ignite collective action so that we can co-create anti-racist systems in Southwest Florida. We really do believe that we have to change the policies, practices, and beliefs that exist in our systems in Southwest Florida and beyond in order to really start to address these issues. Next slide. Why do we want that? We want that for a better future, right? So, FutureMakers has the work that it's doing, but really dealing with and eliminating the inequities in our community will result in better housing and home ownership, integrated neighborhoods. It will help minimize wealth disparities, and people will be able to get good paying jobs. We would have everyone would have access to high quality healthcare. Our education system would be producing equitable outcomes for all students, regardless of who they are, where they come from, and then also a fair justice system. So that's really what we're striving for when we talk about equity in our community. That's what we should all envision and be aiming for And hopefully that makes these uncomfortable conversations more bearable, that big goal for a better future at the end. Next slide. So before we get started, and I'm guessing I probably don't have to tell you this, but this is a brave space. And so it's very important that we are open to understanding other people's perspectives, be open to changing our mind. I know that's really hard these days. I feel like people don't always feel open to changing their mind, but in this situation we have to, because there's so much we don't even realize going on in our lives that has to do with racism, and we have to really unlearn a lot of things in order to do better. We hope that you'll be willing to share your thoughts, since there are just a few of us in here today live. It's a great opportunity for you to chime in and ask questions and participate. And it's okay to have an unpopular view, and it's okay to share that, as long as we view this and as a brave space and exercise that community agreement with each other that we can have a courageous conversation here. Next slide. So just as a reminder, if you've been here before or if you have not, the reason why FutureMakers Coalition is doing this work is because we have a big goal of transforming Southwest Florida's workforce by increasing the number of working age adults who have some sort of education and credential beyond a high school diploma. We want to do that. We want to get to 55% of the working age adults in Southwest Florida having a credential beyond a high school diploma, because we know that by the year 2025, more than 67% of the jobs in the state of Florida will require some sort of industry certification, degree, or other high quality credential. And our region is at a disadvantage if we don't have the kind of workforce that our economy requires and our employers need. And obviously that trickles into many, many things. So that is the FutureMakers goal, to get to 55%. Next slide. Since we started, we really started and we kicked off in 2014. We started building our network in 2015. We used 2013 as our baseline year because FutureMakers did not exist at all in 2013. And since that time, we've added nearly 31,000 credentialed workers, and that's a very big deal. We're talking about folks that are aged 25 to 64. So it's not just counting everyone that earns a degree here. They actually have to stay and become part of the workforce to count. And so we're really, really proud of that. It's fantastic news, and it really has taken the region working together to get to that point. Next slide. But the problem is when you look at the trend of where we've been in terms of attainment, it's basically flat. So every percentage point is thousands of credentials, but we're not approaching that red line in this slide as quickly as we need to in order to hit the 55% goal by the year 2025. And we believe that a big part of the reason why we're not moving fast enough is because our systems, our policies, practices, and beliefs are still holding back people of color in education and workforce development. Next slide. So with that, it is my pleasure to introduce Diane O'Day. Diane is a third-year PhD student studying ethics, civic engagement, and organizational behavior with a diversity, equity, and inclusion lens. She has been formally engaged in equity work since 2016. Beyond engaging with people through the DEI-related presentations, Diane academically researches best practices of equity planning and civic engagement of underrepresented communities. As a research assistant, Diane has experience analyzing equity-related data from both quantitative and qualitative sources. She holds a bachelor's degree in philosophy and a Master of Public Administration degree. And we are very excited to have her here today.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me today. Like Tessa said, my name is Diane O'Day, and it's Great to meet you all or see your faces again for those who I know. So yes, today we're going to talk about increasing equity in your organization. So even though I am a PhD student, I always try to approach things from a practical standpoint. I'm what you would call a pracademic. So anything I learn, I try to share it with the community and have it have usefulness for the rest of society. So today I'm just going to offer some practical tips on how to get started with equity planning in your organization, especially within the context of COVID-19. Next slide, please. So just, Tessa just touched upon this, just a little bit about me. So yeah, as a graduate research assistant, I've been doing diversity, equity, and inclusion consultant work, and most of my experience currently has to do with the county and city level. So I primarily focus on local government and local nonprofits. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's talk about the current context of where we are right now and why equity planning has become such a hot topic and at the forefront of a lot of people's minds. It's maybe no surprise to you that COVID-19 has caused a lot of economic devastation, but paradoxically, there's a lot of budget cuts due and great need. So there's both budget cuts and great need due to COVID-19. So a lot of revenues lost, but at the same time, due to such economic devastation, there's a larger strain on nonprofits and government entities. And also, it should be no surprise to you that following national civil unrest, many organizations and businesses have made very concrete statements that they will be working towards dismantling systemic racism. So that's become a huge priority of a lot of organizations. And a third factor that's impacting people who work in organizations is baby boomers continue to leave the workforce, meaning that the demand for new employees becomes greater. So due to COVID-19, a lot of people are retiring early, which has really highlighted the need for what is known as succession planning. So planning for how to replace the baby boomer generation who's occupying the workforce. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to offer a quick snapshot of some demographics of the 5 counties in Southwest Florida, just so we could kind of see why equity planning is so important. So as you see, a lot of counties within Florida are not necessarily majority white. So Charlotte obviously is the highest one here. However, places like Hendry County are 55% Hispanic. So this highlights that Southwest Florida is very racially diverse. And so therefore, organizations should also mimic that. Now, I also included just some other stats for people to keep in mind. I always think it's important when talking about diversity, equity, inclusion to also think about people with disabilities. Obviously, there's a lot of other things we can talk about today, but when it comes to equity planning, racial is what I'm going to primarily focus on with a little bit of disability. So this is people with disabilities under 65. So as you can see, Charlotte County has 14.9% people with disabilities who are under 65. And also it's really important to think about the minority-owned businesses within the region. The reason why is because, as we'll talk about later, equity planning also makes an effort to enhance relationships with minority-owned businesses through contracting, or that's a route you can go. You don't necessarily have to. Next slide, please. Okay, I have the chat open, so I just had a question for attendees. In the current context, what would you say are the biggest issues facing your organization? So if you just want to write it in the chat, I'd appreciate it. So for a lot of people, it's usually budget cuts or the furloughs. There's been furloughs, you know, so yes, decreased revenue is a big one. So there's a lot of, you know, across the board budget cuts for organizations, meaning that no one's spared because of COVID-19. So yeah, a lot of it does have to do with decreased revenue. So trying to work-life balance. So that's a huge one right now. So employees with kids in virtual school. So trying to balance. So as many of you may know, the working from home situation has become very difficult for people as they try to do work-life balance. So equity planning can actually think about that, can actually prepare for that because work-life balance is a part of supporting your diverse employees. Raising money for an annual campaign, yep. We'll talk about how equity planning can help you enhance the ways that you reach out and get money. Okay, balancing the needs of students, dealing with concerns. Yeah, so how can you still continue to be sensitive to the needs of your the people you serve while also dealing with everything else? So equity planning kind of provides a roadmap for being sensitive to the needs of many people. And it's my opinion that if you develop a culturally sensitive approach, you can also develop the same tools to be empathetic to different issues facing students or clients within COVID-19. Okay, training volunteers to address equity. That's a huge one. So we'll talk about that as well. How do you start? And I have some useful toolkits for you all to use. Okay, so let's talk about what equity planning actually is. You know, so with equity planning, it's different than the money planning. This is, so I've always seen that equity, when you see equity, it's financial, but equity planning, it's a type of strategic planning that incorporates considerations related to providing fair outcomes for vulnerable individuals. So it's important to know that equity is not the same as equality. In equality, everyone's treated the same and exposed to the same policies and rules. However, equitable practices acknowledge current and past barriers to participation, and they work and meaningfully work to dismantle those barriers. So basically, you're making a strategic plan with the actual goal of increasing equitable outcomes. Next slide, please. So many of us have probably seen this slide or a version of it that shows what equity is versus equality. Equity is making sure everyone has the tools necessary to thrive. So I always like this because I think it's a very simple way of pointing out what equity planning is. Equity planning is just making arrangements so people can all have equal access. So in this example, the ramp and the 2 boxes, that's what equity planning is. It can be as simple as just making sure that people have the proper physical accommodations. That's where you could start with it, really. All right, next slide, please. So it's important to think about the different types and approaches of equity planning. So the 2 that I'm going to focus on today that I'll be offering potential strategies for, have to do with cultural competency and structural approach. A cultural competency approach, much like what Nate just mentioned, is where efforts are put towards training employees on diversity, equity, and inclusion related issues such as implicit biases, cultural sensitivity, microaggressions, lots of different ways. So it's basically training the individual to develop and enhance their interpersonal skills and their skills, their empathetic skills and things like that. Now, these aren't mutually exclusive, both these approaches. You can do them in tandem. The second type of approach is a structural approach where efforts are made to exchange or to change the existing status quo by evaluating the diversity of your workforce, looking at policies and processes in order to identify barriers to participation, and augmenting contracting and procurement services in order to support minorities. So someone mentioned that they're struggling to find people who are available in the labor pool. So with a structural approach to equity planning, efforts would be made to develop current employees and look at ways to recruit and retain more diverse employees. Next slide, please. Okay, so I always like to give the, well, what's in it for you? Why would anyone engage in equity planning other than it's the awesome right thing to do? So a lot of empirically proven benefits. It assists with effective use of resources. If you are making an intentional effort to put money towards the most vulnerable people, that will have more impact per dollar. A diverse employee base results in more motivation and innovation amongst your employees. That's because multiple people can draw on different experiences in order to help with different ideas and decision making, and the ability to be authentic helps people feel more motivated in the workplace. Planning for equity can result in strong stakeholder relationships. So if you make a stand that you are committed to equity, you can make relationships with other minority serving institutions and organizations in order to enhance your relationships for people who work on this, which in turn makes decision-making processes more robust. If you're coming up with new policies or programs, the more diverse voices you have representing different people and different interests, the more, the better the processes during decision making will be, and the less likely you are to have to keep going back and changing things because it didn't work. And also, as Tessa showed in the A Better Future slide, a focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion, which will be referred to as DEI in the future, in strategic planning has the potential to empower community members. So it positively impacts health outcomes, housing outcomes, employment outcomes, educational attainment, etc. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so this, I'm going to give everyone, or Tessa will be giving everyone a link to the PDF of this PowerPoint. And so I always like people to have like a one-pager to look at. So these are what I call, I'm currently developing as the 6 dimensions of equity planning. So if you'll look to the left, we go at the individual, group, and institutional level. And also when we think about these different levels of equity and where equity and inclusivity is happening, we also need to look internally, so look at ourselves and the way our organization is operating, but we also need to look externally. So how is our organization interacting with our clients? If you'll notice, there's a bunch of dotted lines for the borders. The reason why I did this is because I really want to reiterate that these are not mutually exclusive efforts. A lot of these will impact another. For instance, a lot of institutional processes could have the potential to impact people individually. And also internal functioning really can enhance external functioning. So we're going to go through each level. So I have these, so don't feel like you have to memorize all these. I'm going to show them again by the individual, group, and institutional. We're going to explore them, then we're going to look at potential strategies. Then we're going to do a case study at the end of each one where I'm going to ask you all for how you would handle that particular situation. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so when we think of the individual level considerations, we need to look at different questions such as, are employees, well, hold on, I need to start. I need to back up for a second. It's important to realize that on that 6 dimensions, there's no right or wrong way to begin. I created this because I want people who may feel like this is a very daunting task to be able to pick a level and then pick just one question that they can just explore with their staff. I really want this to be accessible. So these questions are obviously all questions you need to consider, but starting with one, there's nothing wrong with starting with one, because each one of these questions is very loaded and there's so much good work that can be done with each one. So let's continue. So at the individual level, you want to think about, are employees supported in pursuing further equity efforts? Are they, like, basically, are they given the support if they want to engage in things that help the organization enhance its equity? Are they supported physically, like with FTE, and you know, mentally, like are they supported? Do they have the explicit support of leadership, etc.? What values and skills do your current employees have? How culturally sensitive are they? Where do they need to be? Are there employees who could really develop? So do you have a minority employee who can really develop more skills in the future that you could help them work on? Do employees feel like they can be authentic in the workplace? This is huge. So when it comes to having diverse employees, it's one thing to have a bunch of diverse employees in a workplace, but you need to make sure that they are not pressured to just give into the dominant, often white ideals or groups or ways of thinking. So when we talk about authenticity, it's the employee's ability to be themselves and openly express their cultural differences from other people. Being authentic in the workplace is huge to an employee feeling included and feeling valued, and thus helps them feel motivated. And also, do employees have the resources to do their job well? So if I'm an employee and I really want to be equitable in my organization with clients, do I have those resources? Am I given any opportunities to become more culturally sensitive? And also, you know, thinking through what the client experience may be like, and also what accommodations are in place for people with unique needs. So obviously in Southwest Florida, translation services would be huge. You know, you want to make sure that people speak Spanish, you want to make sure people speak Creole, and just identifying other major languages that are spoken amongst the clients in your organization would be very important. And also, how compliant are your spaces with the American with Disabilities Act? Okay, so I see that authenticity is a struggle. Yeah, authenticity is always a huge issue in the workplace, and it's one of the biggest things. So when we look at strategies, which is the next slide, please, we can kind of look at how can you help your employees feel like they can be more authentic. Okay, so some individual level strategies include developing training opportunities related to cultural competency. So related to that is to provide opportunities for employees to express, not suppress their uniqueness. So I think these two can really work in tandem. I see that Jessica Homer is in the audience today. So Florida Gulf Coast University, where I worked for 6.5 years, has a great model where they invite employees to use their skills or passions to develop programming for the diversity and inclusion certificate program. So I think, I may be biased, but I think that's a great way to provide an opportunity for an employee to express their uniqueness and use it to inform and educate other people in the organization. Also, you know, this one's touchy for a lot of people, but it's always important to perform a climate survey to understand your employee attitudes and competencies. So this one's very important to think about. If you do a survey to see how employees are feeling about equity-related efforts, it's important to pay particular attention to those who identify as a minority in the workplace. It's been in my experience that many people who are in the dominant group will rate, they oftentimes rate the workplace equity higher than what individuals who belong to the non-dominant group would express. So it's really important to give a lot of heed to what your minority employees are saying in that situation. It's also important to ensure that individual employees are given full-time equivalent to help with DEI, meaning give them a few hours a week or so. That way they're not feeling like they're having to do this as extra emotional labor or extra physical labor even. And also related to FutureMakers, always look at ways to enhance employee credentialing and professional development. Now, this one, I'm going to bring it back to FGCU again, but FGCU has just developed a program to offer high-level credentials to people in different badges when it comes to developing different areas of expertise. So exploring ways you can help your employees professionally develop, especially if you see that you have an employee who is really talented and has a lot of potential, but needs just that extra credentialing to move forward in their workplace. It's also important to look and make sure that you do have translation services and access for differently abled people. And also look at barriers involved with recruitment and hiring. In certain counties, especially rural ones in Florida, access to the internet is very difficult to have. So if you're doing online only applications, what options do you have for someone who wants to work for you? Do you have a computer located in your lobby where they could fill out the application? Is there a paper application you're willing to accept? Little things like that can be huge barriers to people when it comes to equity. All right, next slide, please. All right, so this is a case study. So this is where I want to hear from you all. So we're just going to think through what some options for this organization would be. So Mary Bell is a Latina woman working at a local nonprofit. Despite the well-meaning nature of her coworkers, she notices that they often say or do things that are culturally insensitive towards ESL clients, such as repeating themselves loudly in English. If you were to view her situation from an equity planning standpoint, what options would you consider for Mary Bell, her coworkers, and her clients? Now, this is actually based on a real example in a nearby county. So here in Oregon, I'm in Portland right now, but so what would you all do based on this suggestion? And you can just write it in the chat. And there's no right or wrong answers to what you would do, because they're all valid. And if you're making any kind of effort, if you care at all. Okay, so I see cultural competency training. Yes, that's a huge one. So helping people understand why repeating yourself loudly in English would be what we call a microaggression, which is a seemingly small thing that you do to someone that's largely offensive. Okay, so it's important not to put the ownership on Maribel to address this situation.
So I think that's a great point. So oftentimes when you see people on equity committees or diversity committees, oftentimes it's a person of color, or, you know, the person who's the minority in the workplace who has to do a lot of the work to, um, you know, work on equity stuff. So it's important to realize, and Jessica's hitting on a point that I'll make later, but I'll just make it now. It's important to know that equity is everyone's responsibility. So when it comes to Maribel, I would say that, I mean, I don't have a right or wrong answer for this because I was just curious what everyone else would say. But when it comes to Maribel, you know, I would make sure, if I were in that organization, I would make sure that Maribel had a some kind of resource to be able to go talk to someone about it and share her concerns. So does she have an office that she can approach? So basically it'd be important to make sure that Maribel has the resources and feels empowered enough to say something about her coworkers, but to also not put it all on her. So I also see intertwine basic customer service skills. Equity talk needs to be infused into every decision, or it's not a value. So yes, so in this situation, I would, if I were like Maribel's boss, I would make it clear that we all have work to do. I have work to do, and I study this. You know, it's not, equity is not an endpoint, and it never will be. We all have ways we can continue to learn. So yeah, if I were a boss, I would make it clear that that is a organizational value, and then I would look into you know, making sure that all employees have the translation services in place and know how to access translation services. And also I would develop trainings, you know, and if Maribel wanted to, she could do the training, but as we've talked about with emotional labor, it's not necessarily fair to put all that on one employee. All right, next slide, please. So now we're going to talk about the group level. So this is basically the interpersonal. So when it comes to how are people interacting with each other in the organization. So we need to look at, do group dynamics support authenticity? Is there a lot of groupthink going on? Do employees not give much credit to minority voices or minority opinions? There is a minority in power, because you'll see this be kind of a minority or a diversity endeavor that people will do, where they put minorities in positions of power. But it's important to consider if they have active power, meaning is the leadership or the power that you put them in, are they respected and valued in that position? Also, is there a mutual exchange of ideas and support? Again, are you avoiding groupthink? And then, do employees have access to affinity or resource groups? So this is more common on larger organizations, but there are culturally specific, they're called employee resource groups or affinity groups, where employees are encouraged to meet up and, you know, just kind of talk to each other, vent to each other, whatever, about what it's like belonging to a certain group. So for instance, you could start a, so earlier was mentioned work-life balance with virtual school and stuff. You could have a mother's employee resource group. So working mothers or working parents, it doesn't have to be just mothers. And, you know, just having them meet and discuss and share ideas about how to make things better. Now, or make things better, like tips and tricks and stuff. Now, it's important to know that in these groups, a lot of great ideas for enhancing different business practices can also emerge. For instance, there was a Latina working group for a popular department store who they had one of these groups, and through that group, they came up with culturally specific gift cards for that department store, which were later implemented. Also, it's important to think about, well, what relationships do your organizations have with minority institutions and businesses? And also, what efforts are made to engage with minority groups in the area, and how can minority groups give feedback? It's important to look at these relationships, and they're all kind of working in tandem here. But it's important to look at these relationships with minority serving institutions and businesses, because these are areas where groups are already meeting, and we'll talk about this here in a second, but where minorities are already gathering. So having relationships with those groups can result in more robust stakeholder relationships. So we'll move on to potential strategies in the next slide. Thank you. And Kim is doing such a great job. Thank you so much, Kim, for so expertly handling this PowerPoint presentation for me. Okay, so at the group level, establishing employee resource groups. So, you know, giving them, you know, hey, on Thursdays at 2, you know, we're gonna meet in the conference room for an hour and have a snack or something. Encourage culturally specific innovation amongst employees. So really make sure that your employees know that they're valued and that their experiences with different things are valued. So I'll say, as someone who grew up very impoverished, when I worked in a former job where we worked with students, I was able to make a lot of accommodations in the workplace because I was empowered by my coworkers to make accommodations for how we could better serve low socioeconomic status students. So really helping people use their past experiences to enhance current practices is important. And also it's important to offer mentorship for minority leaders. Oftentimes, people are put in positions of leadership, and this isn't just with minorities, but they're not given much support on what to do, how to do it, how to get, how to handle situations, etc. So mentorship opportunities amongst leaders is very important. And beyond mentorship, there's something called sponsorship, where an executive leader will take on another lower level like manager and really work with the goal of developing them to open up more opportunities as they grow in their position. And also it's important to make sure you have seats on your boards and committees for minority group representation. And also related to that is performing an audit of third spaces. So are there areas of the community that you are not seeing or not being able to interact with because the traditional methods of outreaching to them hasn't been working? In that case, you would try to work with third spaces. So in my experience in Southwest Florida, I've worked with school liaison groups, especially in predominantly Hispanic areas. The person who's the school liaison or the parent liaison can help facilitate and help you get the trust of those people. And also culturally specific churches and charities frequented by culturally specific people is all great ideas to engage outside external community members. Okay, next we're going to go to the case study. Okay, so this case study is about how to enhance your outreach. So employees of a local public health organization evaluate their visits and learn that their clients are predominantly white. At the same time, the organization is located within an area that is known for having high rates of Latinx and Haitian individuals. What equity planning options do these employees have? So what would you do if you're noticing, so that's one step, reviewing your data and reviewing your visits. And if you're noticing that you're still seeing a lot of people from majority white when your community is still majority minority, how would you go about planning to enhance your amounts of clients? So I'm seeing, do we have someone who speaks Spanish, French, and Creole who can advertise and promote to the local community? Yeah, so our services advertised in the different languages. And so that goes into our translation services available. But yeah, like when we're doing outreach, are we making it understandable for people? Okay, so I also see work with groups who serve those populations to make partnerships. Yeah, like having a health fair, you know, like I've worked at some culturally specific health fairs in my day. Yeah, so, you know, partnering with a local organization. Yeah, I'm trying to think. So when I did worked at a culturally specific health fair, it was a partnership with a local African American fraternity, and it was hosted at a predominantly minority high school. Okay, find ways to engage the community to understand how, oh, I love this one. So find ways to engage the community to understand how could you serve them better, be a resource. See, this is a really important point. So when I talked earlier about how you can get more bang for your buck with equity planning, it's important to evaluate the needs of the actual community you're serving. So there may be cultural reasons why these individuals don't want to see a doctor or engage with a health organization. So looking at and engaging with them and understanding what their needs are may help you change what your mission is. Funding is always an issue. Is there a high rate of lack of insurance in the area? Does the organization offer services for free? So yeah, and what kinds of, how are you advertising? Like, are you advertising that it's free? Are you fee appropriate? Like, are your fees matching the needs of the community? All right. Well, thank you, everybody. These were really great suggestions, and I love that everyone's thinking through it. All right, so let's talk about the institutional level, which is next. Okay. So you're going to want to look at, if you're looking at the institutional level, so this is where a lot of evaluation that impacts groups and individuals happens, obviously. So what policies do you have that are supporting or hindering equity? So like if you have a policy, like I said earlier, about online only applications, is that hurting people? If you have like some lovely state departments in Florida, the online only applications, how is that impacting people? Do you have only English applications? How is that impacting people? And then it's important to evaluate what the demographics of your current employees are. And this can go across various different, you can look at a bunch of different, what we call cross sections. So like how many males versus females, what about racial lines, and you can really split that, age, different ways. What are the decision-making structures? So if I am a leader and I'm a person who's a racial minority and I'm a leader, am I part of the decision-making structure, or am I just a manager with no actual power to do anything? And how equitable are current strategic plans? A lot of people have strategic plans in their organization, but a lot of them don't make specific mention of equity. A lot of it's implicit, especially if you're a nonprofit, because obviously if you're in a nonprofit, you really care about this stuff. But looking and making sure that your goals in your strategic plans and seeing how if they are conducive with equity is really important to look at. And also evaluating current hiring and contracting practices. Now, a lot of people, when they think about equity planning, they don't necessarily consider the power that they have in contracting and procurement practices. So it's important to review the criteria that you have for the bidding process if you are a public organization, because oftentimes these decisions unfortunately skew towards really rewarding long-standing large organizations, whereas minority-owned institutions tend to be younger and smaller businesses. So how can you kind of change those practices? And also, you need to think about just society in general and how that may be impacting your ability to do your work. For instance, there's a current political climate surrounding immigration and undocumented workers. So there's a lot of studies on how government services are viewed as surveillance by racial minorities, in particular Blacks and Hispanics. Tend to avoid government services and census taking efforts due to the fact that they do not feel like it's safe to be documented. So you really need to consider if you're in a predominantly Hispanic area and suddenly no Hispanics want to interact with you, is it you or is it part of a broader societal problem? And also, like we looked at earlier in the snapshot, what demographics are present in the area you serve? What legislation can be leveraged to help efforts? So I always love to point out the Americans with Disabilities Act, because I used to do some transportation work, and I would always say, this is not ADA compliant, which usually has teeth behind it. But also equal opportunities and compliance and things like that. And then also, what are grant opportunities to work on DEI efforts? So if you have relationships with minority serving institutions and groups, are you able to pursue culturally specific grants to increase your organization's revenue and ability to help with people? Excuse me. Okay, next slide, please, for possible strategies. All right, so just simply reviewing your mission and vision. Does it support equity and inclusion? Is it implied? Is it explicit? Is it absent? How is your mission and vision tied to equitable practices? And also augmenting hiring practices is important. Instead of having so many formal education requirements, such as bachelor's degree, and this much years experience required, look and see if there's ways you can adjust it for credentials, certificates, and experience. One thing that I think is really important to note here is there are associate's degrees. So if you have an application that says bachelor's degree required, look and see if you can adjust that for an associate's degree. According to the FutureMakers 2019 annual report, it says that 53% of the projected jobs that will be needed will require an associate's degree. So, and also, what are other certificates that someone could have where they could do the job? Also, review minority-owned businesses in your area and engage them in contracting efforts. So like I said, usually bidding processes favor larger institutions, but look and see how you can help those smaller businesses. And also audit your organization for compliance with legislation related to DEI. I've noticed that if you make the case that you're out of compliance with something, suddenly top leadership will be concerned. And also, yeah, establish partnerships with minority serving groups to pursue grants jointly. Okay, so if we can move on to the case study, I want to know your thoughts on this one. Okay. In the next 2 years, an organization will be losing 5 of their oldest employees. And I mean long time employees, not elderly. At the same time, they were recently told that they can expect an 11% reduction in their operating budget. Facing these difficulties, what equity planning strategies can be used? So what do you all think? What would you do if you're facing budget cuts, but you also are facing the loss of some employees? Oh, I like this one. Provide opportunities for training and upward mobility with internal candidates. I really like that one because it's pretty well known that it actually costs a lot more money to go through the process of hiring and developing a new employee versus really developing employees within the organization. So yes, I would look at the internal candidates and look at how could I help them, how I can help them get the kinds of skills and credentials they would need within the 2 years. Any other ideas? This one's hard. 11% reduction is pretty brutal. So. Yeah, everyone is dealing with this one right now, so it's very rough. So what I would personally do is I would start looking at where I'm already doing business and how I could shift to engaging with minority-owned businesses. I would also probably start looking for grant opportunities to make up the 11% reduction. When it comes to employees, so I love the idea of the upward mobility. So evaluating your employees who you can move up, and then you know, look at the different, I would tap into my stakeholder groups and see how I could get the word out that we're hiring. Okay, succession plan, mentoring existing employees, and developing new partnerships with organizations that achieve shared goals. Yeah, it's really, coalitions are really, they're becoming more and more necessary to continue doing good work in today's society. So really, yeah, partnering with a lot of, partnering with other people in order to reach shared goals would be great. Because say I mean, here's my example, because I work in homelessness stuff. If you're an organization doing anti-homelessness stuff and this other organization's doing anti-homelessness stuff, maybe there's a way you could combine efforts and then reduce the administrative costs on both of you, and you know, kind of loosen up some money as you continue to work towards working through your budget reduction. All right, thank you everyone. That was great thoughts. Okay, next slide, which I think is things to remember. Okay, now it's important just to like kind of, because a lot of this is overwhelming. And so it's really important to stop and remember these things. Equity planning is multifaceted. It's what we call an iterative process. What that means is it's always going to be needed. It's always going to keep going. And there's so many different dimensions to it that there's no right or wrong way to start. Like I said earlier, pick a box, pick a question, work on that one. If it's an easy one, that's okay. It's just important to start. Now, continuous review is important. How are you measuring successes and identifying opportunities? One of the major pitfalls in equity planning that I've noticed is that oftentimes people will have a really pretty equity plan or a strategic plan, and then they're not given any tools or resources to actually carry that out. So when it comes to doing continuous review, it's important to put in performance measurements. That way you can kind of figure out what you're doing well and where the gaps still are. It's important to know, just like what someone mentioned earlier, it shouldn't be up to one person. It's everyone's job. So it's important to really reiterate to employees that it's everyone's job and make sure that they know how to lead from where they sit. So if they have some kind of power or discretion over something, how can they use that to be more equitable? It could be something as simple as, you know, making sure all your flyers are in different languages, or making sure your office is ADA compliant. I know that's something I went through with my coworkers when we didn't have an ADA compliant space, and so we changed things. And then there's also a multitude of resources for equity plan online. There's no point in reinventing the wheel or having to go at it alone. And so, like I've said earlier, this PowerPoint is going to be available to you. And so I think Tessa's going to post that link. But if we'll go to the next slide, we'll just see some examples of different toolkits that are available. So there's some related to workforce development, how to evaluate your equity planning, how to help your employees develop cultural competency, implicit bias, so how to develop implicit bias trainings, and also tips and tricks on how to do equity in your community engagement efforts. So these websites, all of them have multiple different toolkits and resources. I just chose the ones most relevant to this presentation, but if you click around, especially in racial equity tools, it's really great because it's like, what's the problem? What do you want to focus on? And you click it, and you click it something else to say, well, I want to do this. And so it's kind of, they're all kind of choose your own adventure, and people have plenty of resources that they're willing to share. And obviously, I am a resource to you if anyone needs to contact me. I'm putting my email address in the box right now. But yeah, I'm happy to help and give you any kind of resources that you may need. So now let's just move on to the Q&A. I'm curious to know what kinds of questions you have. If I don't know the answer, I will admit that and get back to you. But yeah, what questions do you have for me?
Hi, it's Nate from United Way. I figured I'd just be vocal since it's just us right here, and I know we're recording it, but so this is still kind of new for me, but training mass volunteers to consider equity when they're reviewing applications to us as a funder. What are some best practices that are out there? How can I do a better job to train community volunteers on equity when they're looking at dispersing funds in the community?
So is what you're asking, okay, so people who are asking the United Way for funds, are you asking like, how can you train them on how to use those funds equitably?
No, so nonprofit agencies apply to United Way for funding. Right.
Okay.
We bring in the community. So people in the workforce, retirees, people that want to be involved in their community, learn more about their community, they then evaluate that nonprofit's application and try and determine what sort of funding should be directed toward that nonprofit.
Okay.
So how do I train those folks that are coming in from the community to have a stronger consideration of equity when reviewing these applications?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would, in that situation, there's plenty of different like one-sheeters that people have when it's like, if you're going to be reviewing this, here are things to consider. So I would, kind of start poking around at different toolkits. I know that's kind of a hot button answer, but I would look and see like how are other people framing those things, because one thing that I've seen that I really like is kind of a flow chart, like checklist, like, is this serving minorities? Yes. Then proceed to here. And, kind of getting them to think more about impact. Like, so if I would like really reiterate things like, when you're thinking about costs and benefits of this particular project, you also need to think about who it's impacting. So I would, make sure that employees have access to be aware of the structural issues and the historical issues in the area, so they can understand why, like, say there's a project for a nonprofit that's only going to serve Hispanics, helping them understand why that's okay, because a lot of times people will look at things for equality or what can help the most people, but really helping them understand that equity isn't always equal, and that's okay. And you have to look at the impact and who's helping people really be empowered in their community. So yeah, I would just develop, because obviously I'm not certain about how they're making the decisions right now, but I would just offer guiding questions in general when they're making decisions to consider, with particular emphasis on the equity questions.
Okay, thank you.
Diane, do you mind if I add one thing that I think could potentially help, just from Community Foundation to,
yes.
Nate, I think the other thing to consider, and this is sort of how we've done this with FutureMakers, is if there's a training opportunity or an opportunity to provide information in advance to your volunteers, I would strongly recommend that you show local data disaggregated by race and ethnicity, so they can see the group disparities and understand why you're explicitly stating that equity is a priority for the United Way. I think that when you look at those group disparities, it starts to become very clear, and it changes a person's perspective on what needs to be done to help truly support the community in an equitable way. So that's really worked for us in getting people to understand. Like, people wonder why we're talking about equity all the time. If we disaggregate all of the data by race and ethnicity. And so we say, look, if we don't move the needle for this group, we'll never reach our goal of 55% or whatever the case may be. So that helps. And it can be very, very powerful, not only with your funding, but sort of changing the culture of the way the community thinks about their hometown, about their place, right?
I think that's wonderful. Excellent advice. Yes, exactly. You want to make sure that they're understanding why outreaching to a minority group is actually going to make a lot of impact and why it's needed. So yeah, no, that's awesome.
Thank you both.
Yeah, of course. All right. Are there any other questions? I know it's just the small of us. So, well, if you do have any other questions, you know, my email address is in the chat, so feel free to reach out to me. But thank you all for listening today. I really appreciate it, or whenever you're listening to this. So.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Diane. That was fantastic. Like I really love the practical approach. I love the six steps, or I forget how you labeled it, but what a useful tool. So thank you so much for sharing that with us. And so I put the links that were in that last slide into the chat for you. If you want to click on them and open them in your browser, you can. We'll also send out, I also put a link to the actual full presentation. If you want to just click on that and download it and save it, you'll have everything there. So that's available for you. And then next up, I just want to mention some future conversations that we have coming up that you might be interested in. On September 17th, we have our annual Breakfast of Champions for FutureMakers. It's going to be virtual, so anyone can attend. And it's sort of the state of the union for FutureMakers, and the champions are all the region's highest level leaders who are leading organizations and institutions and school districts and economic development offices, where they all come together to learn what's been going on, what we need to do to move forward, and also in hopes of re-engaging around empowering the people that they influence to work with us, to work with the coalition year round. So that's September 17th. Anyone can watch it. You can register on the FutureMakers website. I'll put some links in the chat as well. The next one is the equity and COVID next equity and COVID conversation is Leading with Dignity, and I'm excited about this one. It is actually coming to us from Bay State, the healthcare system in Massachusetts. The former diversity and inclusion officer from Lee Health she relocated, I think, 2 years ago, taking a job in Massachusetts, but she's coming back to give us her knowledge. She's a fantastic resource. We lost a good one when she left Southwest Florida. So she's going to be doing a discussion on leading with dignity, which is something that she does within her own organization up in Massachusetts. So it'll be very valuable to people leading organizations or working to increase equity in their organizations as well. And then we are always updating these as people come and say they're willing to do these presentations. We're constantly adding them to the events page on the FutureMakers website. And we also put them in our newsletter. So if you want our newsletter, you can sign up on the FutureMakers website. You can just click on the info@futuremakers.com, send us an email, and we can add you to our newsletter list. So I'm going to put some of those links in here, and then so you can access them. And then next slide. And then finally, if you could take a couple minutes, it's a very short evaluation of today's conversation. And in that evaluation also, you have an opportunity, if you want to tell us other things you would like for us to try to talk about, to find expertise to talk about, and or if you have something that you would like to share as a leader of one of these conversations, we would love to hear it, plus any feedback that you have in general. So we appreciate that feedback, and we do use it. And next slide. Is there another slide? No, I think that's it. Yep, so that is the end. So I just want to thank you all again for being here and spending the time with us today. We hope you found it useful, and have a great long weekend.